This meeting is being recorded. Hello, Kristine.
Hello, Jelle. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
We are both in Utrecht.
Indeed,
right?
Not too far from each other.
Not too far apart, but also not in the same place. Well, it's great that you could join me here in this interview series that I'm doing. And I'm especially really interested in talking with you because you are the most transdisciplinary person from my perspective that I've had in the series so far, because we've been talking mostly about creativity and multidisciplinary teams and design processes and in well, still sort of in a technical context, because we are of course at the technical university, but you come from a very different background. So yeah, let's we can talk about that and why I think it's very interesting to have you on the show. But maybe can you first to start that off, introduce yourself a little and who you are, where you work, and what you are doing at the moment in terms of research and work and so on.
Okay, so I'm Kristine Steenbergh. I'm an associate professor in English literature at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. So I work at a humanities faculty. And I specialize in the early modern period. That's the 16th and 17th century. In English literature, that's Shakespeare first and then everyone else. And I also specialize in the history of emotions and in environmental humanities. And I think it's the last specialization that you want to talk about mostly today.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's going to be really connecting to the topic of the project that the students are working on this in this year, but also more in generally, of course, it's already cool to just explore how somebody who is a specialist in Shakespeare is going to be relevant for technical, let's say, civil engineering students who are thinking about the organization of landscape in the Netherlands. So I think that's already an exercise in transdisciplinary thinking, which is what the course or the master program in general is about. Can you tell us a little bit what is the trajectory from Shakespeare, so to speak, from the period in English literature that you were also I think you did your PhD on, right? And then to what you call environmental humanities, and can you maybe explain what you mean with the term environmental humanities?
Yes. So I'll start from my personal trajectory and then I'll broaden out into what the environmental humanities are. So I was working on the history of emotions, first on vindictiveness and then on compassion. And from that perspective, so I was working on how different cultures shape different emotions and how the things you do in your daily life, but also the narratives you tell yourselves, the dreams you have, shape the way you feel. So that emotions are not universal for everyone. There are certain basic ingrained biological elements, of course, but very much the way you express and experience your emotions are shaped by the culture that you're in. And I was always already very concerned about the environment and the ecological crisis that we're in. And I connected the two. I thought the way we engage with our natural environment is very much shaped by the way we experience it and the way we narrate our relation to the environmental humanities, to the environment, the stories that we tell ourselves. And the period that I was working on is very pivotal. It's kind of a key shift in the way we perceive those relations, because the idea in the environmental humanities is that in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, there was still a more organic sense of relating to the environment, and in the early modern period, people start to see humans as separate from nature. So this nature culture binary starts to come into existence, and also as above nature. So the idea that you can control nature, explore and exploit it to further human inventions, design maybe also to come close to your field, but the idea that nature is a resource for human inventiveness, that comes in the Renaissance or the early modern period, with the rise of empirical science and colonialism. And there are all these shifts in culture that also shape a shift in how humans relate to nature.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So can you tell a little bit more? Because when I think about my own education, the saying sort of empirical science and colonialism in one sentence was not common in my, when I did, and I think you are sort of from the same generation. So when we were in high school, or maybe even when we were studying, at least where I was studying, in which was more already in the technical world in cognitive science, there was a lot of talk about empirical science, and maybe there was some consciousness of humanism, and the idea of seeing human as separate from the environment was a theme, and whether that was correct, and I was working on embodied cognition and whether our minds are maybe also extending into the world and so on. But it was still very, but this colonial aspect, is it not the case that this is also a trend now that we start to become conscious of that these two are connected? Or is it just me as a sort of technical guy that I was never conscious, and that you guys at the human sciences department were always already working on that already, like 30 years ago? Do you know what, like, when did that?
Well, I think to combine it with the environmental perspective is new. But the idea that empiricism was connected to colonialism, I think that it already existed in a historical perspective. But from an environmental perspective, it's very clear now, if you go to those texts from the period, that the reason colonialism took such a powerful growth in the period is partly because of a lack of natural resources. In England, for example, they had cut down most of the forests in England at the start of the 17th century. So in London, they no longer had wood for their home fires, but also for the big glass industry that started to take off in the period, because people wanted windows in their houses, and you need hot fires for that. So they were using coal in London, sea coal from the coast of Manchester, and that was the first real case of air pollution in a city, because everyone was using coal for their fires. And they needed more wood, and what the colonies offered was wood. So one of the reasons for the colonization of North America by the English was that they saw there were lots of trees there that they could use for their fires and use at home. But also Francis Bacon, for example, the kind of founding father of empiricism in England, was really interested in gathering knowledge from the colonies to improve his own knowledge and his empirical thinking. So his empirical observations were also based in knowledge that he got from informants from the colony.
But if I understand you right, there's really this match between Francis Bacon saying, on the one hand, we can go to the colonies and be the rulers there, so dominate that whole area and get from it what we want, and we're going to be the boss. And his more sort of philosophical idea that humans are the rulers of the world they see. So I'm looking out in the world, and I'm understanding the world around me is means that I dominate it, that I enslave it, so to speak. He even said something like that, right? Like, grab nature by the hair and drag it, or I don't know, some.
Well, there are even worse metaphors. There's a feminist scholar, Carolyn Merchant, who's written a book on how he sees nature as passive, but also as female. So there are a lot of sexual metaphors involved also in that idea of going to a virgin country and taking it for your ruler, and also digging into mines and taking things out of it. So there's an image, but no, you're right. The idea that isn't on my screen now. Yeah, you're back.
Yes, okay. The idea that's where it stopped.
The idea that with more knowledge, humans can control nature and use it for their own purposes. that is certainly connected. And so there is the idea of empirical science and the idea of controlling nature in the early modern period are certainly very much connected. But there are also interesting scholars looking at Bacon's writings and saying, well, it's more nuanced than that. And he didn't only want to dominate nature, but he was also looking at very specifically and observing very closely what plants are doing, for example. So that it's a bit of a caricature to say empirical
Sure.
science, it means dominating nature. But if you look at the writings of the period, there's certainly that idea of if we know everything, we can also control it, and we can further human exploits, using nature.
And that idea, did that remain until the present time, or is it change? I think it's changing now, but when did that start? Is that not happening now, or is it? Are we already in the next phase? Or
well, I don't like to think of history as lines of developments going from there to here. So I think there's always resistance movements. If you think, for example, of the Romantic movement in the 18th, 19th century, which resisted the big industrialization of that period when factories came up and cities were growing, you suddenly get these romantic poems in literature, but also it's a broader movement who start to want to connect with nature more and study nature on different terms than just using it for human purposes. So I think every era has its developments and then kind of counter developments. But because the ecological crisis is so pressing now, I do think that you can say that more people are aware now that this view of nature as only a natural resource is maybe not a good idea.
No, okay. And can you explain how should we look then, or what would be a different way of looking at nature?
Yeah.
And maybe also why, that's maybe too big a question, but after that I would like to talk about why your background and your field of research, which is in the humanities, what does it have to offer to that kind of thinking? Like how does that help us think differently?
Yeah. Well, I think a different way of engaging with nature that would be helpful today is to not see humanity as separate from nature, but to see us as interdependent, as humanity as part of nature, but also to look at all the ways in which we are entangled with all kinds of ecological and natural processes. And once you become aware of that, you, I think, will also shape relations that are more reciprocal. So not just using nature for your own purposes, but also providing for nature and making sure that there is this ecological balance that we need. I think that it is important to not only start at changing our practices, but to also start at changing the ways we view that relation. So shaping different stories, different pictures in our minds, different experiences, so that it becomes, well, you from your body-mind perspective will certainly agree, I think, so that it becomes ingrained in the way that we experience nature.
So this has to do with language immediately, right? So you say how we understand things is, can I say how we talk about it? What words we use, what terms we use to make sense of things? Is that?
Yeah, but maybe also how we experience it in a more bodily sense. I noticed during the first lockdown, for example, during the pandemic, that there were a lot of articles in newspapers, but also blogs and things going around of people who were for the first time taking the time to sit in their garden and just observe what was going on there, and discovered kind of the agency of nature, that nature could do things that they weren't aware of just by listening and watching and smelling and being there and taking the time. And I think that already changed their relationship to nature, because they were more immersed in it, also bodily and with the senses, rather than just cycling past it or seeing it from the train on the way to work, maybe.
Exactly. So this brings us maybe to this paper that we've been talking about briefly, which is about scalability and non-scalability.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a link there because at this moment, so who was the author of the paper? I don't have it lying here.
That paper was by Anat Singh.
Oh yeah, Anat Singh on non-scalability. I will put it on the website so students can click on it and read it. But maybe can you explain, because this sort of sitting in your garden and just experiencing very locally what happens in a qualitative way, I would also say, instead of, and I sort of have the idea that this is contrasted with standing from a side, looking at it as a kind of scientist or engineer or controller in the traditional caricature sense of the word.
Yeah.
Modeling it, controlling it, measuring, and then making some kind of general scientific story out of it. I think maybe that's the contrast, isn't it? Can you say a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think that's important, both for how we experience nature, but maybe also for how we do interdisciplinarity in a way. Yeah, but what Singh...
okay, so it's a complex thing. Let's break it down.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can start from, because fly in from another article that I'll also mail to you, that you can put it on the website.
Sure.
By Lorraine Code, where she argues that there are different ways of doing science. And one is the outside perspective that you sketched. And that's often based on a kind of empirical observation of a small aspect of the problem. So you have a complex problem.
Sure.
For example, her example is Rachel Carson's book, A Silent Spring, that was written in 1962. It's a famous book in the environmental movement because it started an awareness of what pesticides were doing to the environment. And there you have scientists studying pesticides in a lab and saying, this works, so let's use this across the world to counter pests. And she observed what these pesticides were doing to the environment. And that was really the start of the awareness that this is not a good idea to spread them. But her way of research is to combine lab observations on what pesticides are doing with going out into the countryside, observing what was going on there, but also talking to people, studying small insects that were suffering the impact of the pesticides.
Because to go one step back, so the pesticide worked in the lab, but if you put it out in the real world, there were lots of other factors,
side effects,
making that this pesticide was actually not doing what you really wanted it, or maybe you could say it meant that we really didn't understand the complexity of the problem that we were trying to solve in a way, right? Because it solved this aspect of the problem, but that was sort of like a toy version of the problem. But in the real world, the problem was much more bigger. So the pesticides also screwed up a lot of.
Right. So you have an insect on eating your crop, and to solve that problem, you use pesticides. But these pesticides have a major impact on the whole ecological system surrounding your field, are killing off all kinds of useful other insects, but also seeping into the ground, going into the water, having effects on human health as well.
All kind of feedback effects. And,
And you have your farmers using these products because it's easy and quick, but also suffering the consequences themselves because they're living on the field. So she combined empirical research with going out there, finding out why people are using this, what they need it for, how you could do it differently, looking at all the people who are attached, but also all the animals impacted and plants impacted by these pesticides. And by using this interdisciplinary approach and then writing it down in a way that is really accessible both to scientists and to the general public. So her book is called Silent Spring because it opens with a kind of dystopian view of a countryside village in spring where there are no birds anymore, no insects, there's no sounds anymore that you associate with spring because of the effects of pesticides. And
is it a novel or is it?
No, it starts like a novel because she uses this fictional element there, but it is a scientific exploration of pesticides. And but there also then in her writing, she's really interdisciplinary. So she draws in both the scientists who were working on this and the general public who became aware of what pesticides are doing to the environment. So her book from 1962 started an environmental movement in the US against the use of pesticides.
That's really cool, and a really cool example of well, you call it interdisciplinary. It's maybe trans. Is it trans in the sense that it started a new movement, also a whole new field in a way?
Yes. Yes, yeah, if you call yes, and she was using all these techniques herself and combining them in maybe into a new discipline.
A new way of doing, yeah.
Yeah, so, but Lorraine Code uses it as an example of how if you really sit in a problem and study it from all sides and speak or listen or interact with everyone who is involved with the problem, also animals, and also observe plants closely, but also the people around it, you will reach a different kind of solution, and that won't be a solution that you can then copy and use in other situations again, because other situations will need the same kind of method.
And that's the non-scalability of it.
That's the non-scalability of the problem. And then I thought, okay, what shall I send Jelle? And then I send you this more theoretical article on upscaling and non-scalability. But yeah, that explains what that term means. So upscaling is associated indeed with the view from outside, where you look at a problem and you think, okay, this is how we'll solve it, and then also impose the solution from the outside. So as a scientist, you say, this is what we'll do. We'll spray little particles into the stratosphere in order to counter the light of the sun. And then people who sit in the problem say, okay, but where will you do this? And what will be the local effects? And can you reverse it if it goes wrong? And talk to more parties involved to find a solution that involves a more complex solution, probably, because the problem is more complex. The problem of global warming is more complex than just the sun. We need to change the way we do things in a more complex way.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, like for me, one of the core things about engineering as a way of thinking and looking at the world is to be able to scale in this way. So you make some kind of small prototype, or a proof of principle, or a proof of concept, an experimental setup in your lab, and then the key point is to show to the other people, like, look, it works. And then all the engineers there, if they are trained engineers in that field, they will immediately see it works, and they will never think, yeah, it works here in the lab, but they will immediately see the vista. So it's like, oh, it works, so we can do this big thing now. And very often that also is also the case, right? So there's lots of examples where you do a small scale model, and once you've proven that, yeah, it turns out it also actually works at the bigger scale. But now you are pointing to a type of problems where that strategy no longer applies, right? Because it doesn't scale. So but how do you, I mean, so let's say the COVID crisis, what if a vaccine only works in one country, but not in the next because of these complex, I mean, that would be disastrous, right? We're screwed because we don't have time. I mean, time is the issue.
Yeah, that's
then,
it.
right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and also with climate change, of course. I mean, the desire to spray something in the stratosphere, I can really understand it.
But you don't believe in it.
No, because I think it needs more work than just a technological fix. And also with the vaccine, I mean, I was reading this morning that the nursing personnel didn't ask the members of their association how many of them would take the vaccine if it were available, and only 37% said they would if it had been properly tested. So there are cultural factors around the vaccine again. It's not just that it's available, yes, that's it. And now we need to get people to also use the vaccine. And that again requires thinking about which stories, which desires, which images you shape around the vaccine.
Exactly.
In order
I wrote a blog post saying vaccination starts in your head. Right. Yeah. So if we don't inject the right memes in people's heads, then we have not, then they're not going to take the physical vaccine. So there's no vaccination. Effectively, no people don't get vaccinated, even if the medicine is there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is really cool. Yeah, you talked about how I don't remember her name, but the
Lorraine Code.
yeah,
Or, yeah.
and working with the pesticides.
Oh,
And
Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson, and doing all these different methods and techniques. Maybe could you end with what would be sort of your advice off the cuff if people want to think about nature and culture and the land use in the Netherlands, especially the Veluwe area we're now thinking about. So this is farmland, nature, people living there, tourism, and so on. So, well, lots of different stakes and interests. How would you go about research that? How would you go about thinking about that? And I sort of feel that you would say that you can't do that from behind your screen at the campus.
Yes, agreed. Although there's part of the research you could do there. I mean, I as a humanities person, I would probably start with the history of the area and see how the land was used in the past. Because you were asking earlier, what alternatives can the environmental humanities offer? And one of them is to look at stories from the past, the way these relations were shaped. But you can also, of course, look at land use or water use in the past. I have a colleague at Vrije Universiteit who looks at our amphibious culture, she calls it, of the Netherlands in the past, when we gave more room to water. When the people in the Netherlands gave more room to water in their lives. So the things that we're rediscovering now, that you need places for water in the city where you can store water that comes in big bunches at one time and you may need later, for example. That practice was already here in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But because we built those big dikes, we have this idea that the water is no longer in our country, that we are safe and don't need to deal with it. And we're rediscovering those ways of living with water. Yeah. So you could look at, if you identify the problems on the Veluwe today that you want to look at, you could go back in history and see, okay, how did people deal with these problems in the past? What kind of practices did they have? What kind of narratives did they tell themselves about their involvement with the land? So that might be interesting to have this more layered perception of the landscape, because you know what was there in the past and what happened there. So I think that is one way to start from behind your desk, but I would definitely go there and talk to people and observe and just sit for a day on the Veluwe in a certain spot and see who uses the landscape and how, and really become go into the thick of it to discover all the complexity of the place.
Cool. Well, that sounds really nice. And yeah, I think this is now looking at the time. I think this would be a good moment to round off. So thank you very much for your very interesting view. Really, the most different one, but really very strongly connected to what we're doing. So so that's already a proof, I think, that it's very valuable to bring different disciplines together, because it gives you a new, fresh look at what you are working on. Yeah, so that rounds off the official part. And after that, we can have bonus minutes.
Yay.
So maybe there's more things that you were thinking about, or oh, I should really also say this, or something that came to mind. Was there more stuff that you would like to share with us?
Well, I was thinking of the power of narratives and the alternatives that you asked for. How can the environmental humanities offer alternatives to that view of humans above nature? And the alternative that is often offered in newspapers, or if you ask people, is the idea of going back, as if you would go back to the Middle Ages, and that's not possible. So I think what we need is new narratives based on older traditions in which humans were more enmeshed with the natural world, or on a more equal footing, that have then been adapted to our current society, so that you inspire people to see different ways of viewing nature. Yeah. Because it's still often the case now, if you look at government views of how we should treat nature in the Netherlands, then it's often seen as a service, nature as a service, and that is still the idea that nature serves us, and maybe not as a resource in the sense that we cut down the trees in order to burn them, but in the sense that we can go there to relax maybe, or so it's still a kind of utilitarian perspective where nature has to offer us something. And I think it would be great if we could think of using the knowledge of the humanities, so different cultures, different historical cultures, different narratives that that show humans relating to nature in different ways, and then find writers or comic authors or people who write for TV and have them make new narratives on the basis of that. That would be a great alternative.
That relates
I think.
also, we have not talked about that at all, but in design, we have this whole course on scenario-based design.
Yeah.
So, and when we think about scenarios, we don't necessarily just think about text, because many designers are visually oriented. So often you get a kind of comic stories or storyboards, or posters, or like visionary images with also text, like annotations, showing a possible future, or showing different alternative, like if we make it like this is what will happen, right? This is the, so and that can really help you get clear on what the problem is, but it's also communicative, so you can show it to all the different stakeholders and then have a conversation about the concrete story, instead of about some abstract. Like in the abstract, often people very quickly agree, or they completely don't understand each other, like either one of those two. But if you make things very concrete and well, sometimes we say experientiable, which is not really an English word, I think, but yeah, then you have something to talk about together, right? You can all relate to it, and maybe those narratives have that function, right?
Yeah, and that sounds very different from the approach you were just describing of designing something small in the lab and then taking it out and using it for everyone. Whereas here you are creating a scenario and then talking to people on the basis of it. So you have them experience what you thought might be a good idea, and they respond, and you work that into your scenario again, and then you get a much more layered and complex solution to a problem than if you just think of something behind your computer, I think.
Yeah, so for me, that is really the difference between what I would call engineering in the traditional sense and design research.
Yeah.
So design research makes prototypes, and it can be very concrete, and it's really also about the skill of building things, and not just talking about it, but really physically making something, because then you find out a lot about what actually works or doesn't. Like, can it really exist at all, right? Or is it a fantasy? Many of my students would do projects, and then at some point they in their concept phase, they plug in some kind of artificial intelligence that would be needed to do this step in the whole thing. And then I already know that kind of artificial intelligence doesn't exist. So it's not going to happen. So the whole thing cannot exist, right? So then if you make prototypes, simple prototypes that have no fancy software, then at least you have something on the ground, your feet on the ground, right? So that's the engineering aspect. But then, in my view at least, but that's also a character maybe, but engineers then quickly jump from having this prototype to the big thing. But instead, design researchers would take the prototype as a prototype and put it out there in the world.
Right, yeah.
And then have people talk about it, experience it, try it out, then have reflective conversations about what does this prototype mean if this would be a real product in a real situation and for real, produced, sold on the market, what have you, and with a whole system behind it. How would that be for you? How would that be for the other stakeholders? What would be the possible side effects, and so on? Yeah, and that's indeed a very different approach of research.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think also of bigger structures. I was reading this morning in the Correspondent where the climate journalist Jelmer Mommers just announced that he's now no longer only climate, but he does climate and democracy. And what he discovered in his years as climate journalist is that we need to involve everyone in this problem in a democratic way, not just leave it to the short cycles of politics, which have kind of these short-term perspectives and are not able, or only partly able, to look at the long distance of measures needed for to counter the ecological crisis. And maybe the process you described for designing a product could be also a model for involving people in tackling or at least addressing the ecological crisis, to have them involved in scenarios and to have them talk about what will happen and how it might impact their lives if they need to give up their car or or find a different way of transport, and to really have people talking with each other around a problem. I think that is a much better way than imposing sudden measures, as you saw with the farmers last year, that if you say, okay, we need to solve this now and this is what we're going to do, you will kind of put people up against each other and not around the problem. So yeah, I think that maybe design studies is the way to save the world.
Yeah.
I read a book on the ethics of care in the context of environmentalism, and I remember a quote in there that said, tinkering is care. And I thought of tinkering there, that you have a product, you go out and people say, nah, I want it slightly different, and you go back again and you adjust it. And you can do that in one place, and then you might take the product to Africa or Australia or New Zealand, and they might say, no, we do things differently here, it needs this or this or this, and then you need to work with them again.
That's exactly that's exactly it. And I was thinking also when you said about the democracy and the whole ecology and environmental issue or challenge, maybe we need to make prototypes at a slightly bigger scale than very small things. So maybe we should really, I mean, it would really need a shift, a mindset shift for people to actually do that. But maybe we should start a whole village, like literally, like an area of so many square meters and about 1,000 people there that volunteer to live in a completely new way for, and then maybe not for one day, but maybe really for 2 months or so, and then have a national debate, you know, because these problems are so big that, I could show you the story, but, you know, maybe we need this kind of prototypes that really make you feel it, but that are still not so big that, but I mean, in terms of cost, I mean, the cost of doing it wrong in the end and just finishing the planet are so big that I think we could spend a billion on this prototype. I mean, it would be worth it, right?
They exist, right? There are these. I was reading George Monbiot in the weekend, the Guardian columnist who first wrote a book, How Did We Get Into This Mess? And now wrote a book, How to Get Out of the Wreckage. And what he says we need is belonging. And these smaller communities that exchange knowledge and practices and ideas and work together around a problem. And he says we need stories to change our perceptions. But this idea of transition towns across Europe, I think you have these towns where people decide together, we're going to try to do things differently. And environmentally, but also have our own money and organize our society differently in order to make way for that transition or try out the transition. It exists, so it would be great
to. It sounds great.
Transition towns. Yeah. Tip. Can I give one book tip as final thing in our bonus?
Well, definitely.
It's probably in mirror image, so I'll read it out. It's Another Science is Possible, a manifesto for slow science by Isabelle Stengers, a Belgian philosopher.
Maybe you can send a few of the things that we talked about as a list. And I mean, the general lesson here is we should read, right? Because you've said about 10 times, oh, I was reading this or that the other day. But if you don't read, you don't encounter all this inspiration, right? So reading is still important. Oh, are you still there?
Yeah, there you are.
Back. I think Zoom is telling us that we should quit.
We need to stop. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kristine. And,
You too.
have a nice day and see you later.
And good luck with the course.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.